Okay, can everyone see? You can see this being shared now? Okay, great. Okay, I'll just introduce myself for the first couple of minutes then. For everybody who hasn't met me before, my name's Katy O'Donnell. What I'm going to be talking about today is my doctoral research that I completed in 2020 at the University of Edinburgh. So I did my PhD over the course of 4 years. And it followed a master's that I did on the same topic. So I've been looking at this since about 2015, this topic. And it's just grown and grown as time's gone on. And since I've left my PhD, I've started working with WallCAP on the community archaeology project, specifically advising them about the quarrying aspects of the project. And I also work part-time as a post-excavation archaeologist in commercial archaeology. So I've been splitting my time between the academic side of things and the commercial side of things since I've graduated. Also, just before I start, I'd like to say my supervisors of my project were Professor Jim Crow and Dr. Ben Russell at the University of Edinburgh. And my PhD was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council for the first 3 years. So I'd like to acknowledge their support through the whole thing. Yeah, so I think I'm just going to get into it, but just before I do get into it straight away, I was really curious how many of you all know how to do the raising a hand function on your on here, because I wanted to ask who all was interested in the different aspects of what I'm about to talk about. Okay, I see a couple of people have hands raised. Yeah, oh, there we go. Okay, lots of people are doing it. So I was curious to see, first of all, how many people are interested in this because they're interested in Hadrian's Wall. First of all, so if anyone's just here because they're interested in all things Hadrian's Wall, would you raise your hands? I think we've got 13, 16, 17. Okay, yeah, looks like about 20 people. And then how many people are here because they're interested in either quarrying or geology specifically? Because I do get quite different questions from people from different groups, and I'd like to know which areas to focus on more while I'm going through the presentation. Okay, so it's a lower number of people on the geological quarrying kind of side of things. Okay, cool. Well, that's really good to know. Thank you all for doing that for me. Okay, and then if people pop their hands down again, and then that means if somebody wants to raise it again later on, then we'll notice who's got a question. Okay. Right, so I think I'll just move on to the first part of the presentation here, which is going to be the contents, basically what I'm going to go through in the presentation. So I've split it up into a few different sections, and that's broadly how I arranged it throughout my PhD thesis. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the history of the wall area. So when we're looking at quarrying, the area around Hadrian's Wall is an enormous area, and it's been quarried all the way from the Roman period and probably slightly before the Roman period, all the way up until the modern day. And there are hundreds of quarries in the region that I was studying. So it was really important that I looked at the history of the whole area through all the historical periods to understand what the quarrying practices were and how they changed through time. And then the next part we're going to look at is mapping, and that was how I recorded all the quarries over the areas and different ways that the maps themselves can actually help to distinguish ancient quarries from more modern quarries. The third part is going to look at the material requirements. So I mean by that, how much stone the Romans needed to construct Hadrian's Wall. So if we can compare the amount that they needed for construction to the quarries that we know about, the Roman quarries, we can say the amount of Roman quarries that we've found aren't enough to supply what they needed to construct the wall. So we know that there's quarries missing from the record, or other sources of stone maybe that aren't quarries that are missing from the record, things like rubble at the bottom of the windsill or river gravel. The next thing I'm going to talk about was the fieldwork and the archaeological evidence. Those two kind of fit together. But in that, I'm going to talk about all the different types of evidence that we have for the quarries that we know are definitely Roman. So inscriptions are the main one. And then I'm going to talk about other types of archaeological evidence that are for quarrying in general. So we can see things like lines that have been marked out for blocks to be removed, and then the blocks not being removed, so you can still see the lines that have been traced out. You can see obvious places where blocks have been removed that are very rectangular, sort of unnatural looking. We can see spoil heaps, we can see cart paths, you can see tool marks from chisels and things left on the surface of the stone. So I've got lots of examples of those. And then the final aspect that I'm going to talk about is petrological testing. And that was what I used to compare the type of stone that you see in the quarries to the type of stones that you see in the wall. So I'll go through that all as well. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break. Okay, so this is just a little rundown of why I started doing this project and what we can learn from the project that we don't already know. One of the biggest issues in the study of Roman quarrying in general, like archaeological quarrying, is that it tends to focus on like more expensive stones like marble and granite, and there isn't much of a focus on sandstone or ordinary building stone. I'm not saying that there's none of it, but it's not something that's been done very much in Britain in the past, and it's something that's become a newer field, people looking at the quarrying of ordinary building stone, like sandstones and limestones. And what Hadrian's Wall specifically is bringing to the table is that it's going to help us understand more about the organization of the Roman Empire and how they constructed very large scale monuments. So how did they organize it on a large scale? How did they plan it out? Because that's something that we don't really know about. We can also look at things like the cost of construction, how many people they would have needed for the construction, how far the stone traveled, and if they preferred high quality materials to just the closest stone at hand. Because we know Hadrian's Wall was built over a short period of time. We want to know if they still had time to prioritize certain stone sources, or if it was just, let's get the closest thing possible. Okay, so I think I'm just going to get into the first component, which is the history of the area. And that was what I used to help narrow down the field of potential quarries, which might be from the Roman period. So I'm going to talk about history of the area, historical mapping, and then the more modern mapping. And the picture that I put in here is from a medieval guide to mining and quarrying. And it's got this really great illustration of like miners who are transporting stone in different ways. So when we think about how stone was transported in the Roman period, you think about carts, wagons pulled by animals. But in this illustration, you can see there's people pulling sleds. There's people who filled up sacks and they're using dogs to pull sacks behind them. There's all kinds of crazy things going on. I thought I would put that in because that came up when I was looking at medieval quarry methods. Okay, right. History of the wall area. This is the earliest map that I was able to find that included a picture of a quarry or a mine in it at all. So it's a map of Cumbria from the 1670s to 1690s, and I don't know if you can see my mouse or not. Oh, I've clicked past it. But the sort of the piece that I've focused in on has right in the center of it, there's a little mound that says the mines. And that could either be a mine for ores or probably for slate, which was quite a common thing to be mined in that area. But before that time, quarries, mines were generally not marked on maps at all. So up until about 1800, I couldn't reliably look through historical maps to understand where historical quarries had been. So I had to look through books and all other kinds of references and things like that. Right. I need to move you guys over. Okay, so after the Roman period, in the very late Roman period, 500 to 1000 AD, we know that people did stay in the general area and re-inhabit or continually inhabit the disused Roman buildings. So we've got evidence of that at Vindolanda and Great Chesters, which has early Christian artifacts, Anglo-Saxon. And I've included a picture of a possible chalice that was found at Vindolanda. So we know that people remain living in the area, but we don't know that they needed to continue to quarry for new stone in this period. So because there were so many abandoned Roman buildings and so much stone left behind in the wall, it's unlikely that major new quarries were being opened because they could recycle the stone from these Roman forts and from the Roman towns next to the forts. We've also got things like the quote I've included here, which is just talking about how there isn't any documentary evidence of people that were continually inhabiting that area for large stretches of time. So while I'm looking at potential quarry sites, it's unlikely that any of the undated ones that I find are coming from this period, 500 to 1000 AD. Okay, things changed a little bit in this period, 1000 to 1500 AD. We started to see, in this time, the people that owned the land were mainly the church and the upper classes. And if you wanted to open a quarry on these kinds of lands, you needed to apply for a license to the person that owned the land, either to the church or to the upper class landowner. And they would grant licenses to cut the stone, and they would always have very specific requirements. They would say you can have like 60 yards square of land and you can quarry from that. And we don't have evidence for these at Hadrian's Wall, but we do have them across England. And you see the remains of these quarries, and they're very uniform, very regular, kind of square rectangular quarries. And the ones that we see there undated at Hadrian's Wall are very irregular and sort of long and stretched out. So it's interesting to compare the ones from this period because they are organized, they're laid out quite differently, but which is helpful. But what makes it more difficult is that the actual quarry methods that we used to remove the stones, the tools, were pretty much basically the same. So if we're just looking at tool marks and things like that, you can't conclusively say this is definitely a medieval quarry or this is a late Roman quarry, because they're indistinguishable from each other. I've given a list of examples here of types of ore extraction that were happening around the area of Hadrian's Wall, and that was something that happened that we have records from. So you can see iron ore and lead, but we don't have any evidence of quarrying from this period that's been documented in the areas around Hadrian's Wall, even though it certainly did happen. Okay, and then getting more recent. So at this time, you've got something which is called estovers. And that's when you had tenants that were living on the land of a wealthy landowner, and they had a right to obtain stone they needed for personal buildings on the land owned by their landlord. So they could say to the landlord, I'm going to build some shielings for myself and my family. And then they were allowed to take whatever stone they needed just specifically for themselves to build their own dwellings. But they weren't allowed to cut stone commercially or sell any of that stone. That would be, that money would belong to the landowner. So this is the time when you would start to see sort of small, disorganized quarries opening across areas that were farmland. And you can see some little shielings along the wall as well that are made out of stone. They did recycle Roman stone quite a lot as well in this time, but you did see new small quarries opening. We also still have larger quarries which are owned by the state or by the church. We've got things like quarries open to build roads, like the military road. And you can see these, but these were often backfilled because they had to backfill the quarries to satisfy the landowner. So the landowner could say, yes, you can open a quarry and take as much stone as you need for your house, as long as you completely flatten the ground afterwards and it doesn't cause any disruption to my fields. And we have evidence of that for the construction of the military road and for some of the tenants that were opening quarries on the land of private landowners. The picture that I've included here is from after 1800, but that's from a railway sleeper quarry, which is on Barkham Hill, which was another type of quarry that was open for the hard stone in this period. Okay, right. I'm going to talk about the more modern mapping now. So there's a few different sources for this. We've got the Ordnance Survey, which started producing maps in the 1800s. We've got LiDAR, satellite imagery, and aerial photography. And another source that starts happening in the 1800s is publications by archaeologists or antiquarians who were doing the same thing as me, looking for quarries on Hadrian's Wall. So there's a few other publications that came before mine, which looked at smaller areas. There was one at Vindolanda, the Vindolanda Stone Sources Project. And there's also parts of other publications, like one which is at Housesteads, and they've also produced a map of the nearby quarries. Okay, sorry. Right. So I'm going to come through here. Right, these are some of the earliest maps that were produced specifically of Hadrian's Wall, or geological maps. So I can look through these, and anything that is marked on these maps from the 1800s that says it's a working quarry, an open quarry, active quarry, any of these things, you can say was certainly not being used in the Roman period because it was being used in the 1800s. That's one of the best ways that I have to eliminate quarries from consideration as being possibly Roman. In this picture, we've got at the bottom, that's Ordnance Survey, and then the top one is the Tate geological map of Hadrian's Wall, and then to the right hand side is McLaughlin Survey. Then we've got some of the publications, we've got Housesteads, and we've got Vindolanda stone sources. They looked through various historical records, and then they were able to say what some of the quarries were, if they were the railway sleeper ones, for example, or more unknown ones. And these all got added into a database that I started to collect of potential Roman sites. And then we've got the British Geological Survey. They continue to maintain a map which has every single pit, mine, quarry across the whole United Kingdom, and it has thousands of quarries on it. So this is a picture of what that is with Hadrian's Wall across it in blue, and you can see it. There's a really intense number of extractions going on in the area in the north of England. Obviously the north of England is famous for having lots of coal mines and everything like that, but you can see the real extent of it here. So I had to go through this database that they sent me, and I had to remove everything that they knew the date for, that was a modern one, and anything that wasn't sandstone, limestone, or quartz dolerite, because those are the three main stones that were involved in the construction of Hadrian's Wall. Sandstone is the main stone. Almost the whole wall is made out of sandstone. Parts of it are made of limestone, and limestone also may have been used as a mortar material at various parts along the wall. And then quartz dolerite is something that was used mainly as a rubble component inside the core, the core of the wall. So I had to cut out a lot of this that was in here, and then I narrowed that down. And even narrowed down, this is what it looked like. So that's the Hadrian's Wall is a black line through the center there, and then in yellow you can see sandstone, and blue is limestone, and the pink is the quartz dolerite, which is the material that the windsill is made out of, the great windsill that the wall sits along the top of. Yeah. Okay, then we've got aerial photography. So as you can see in the top image, it is a little bit hard to see sometimes where the pits are, but I've highlighted them down at the bottom where the various quarries are, and there's a mixture of very large ones and much smaller ones, and it is much the same for the LiDAR, which is a 3D mapping method, which you can use in GIS to measure the sizes of quarries and things like that. So I've marked them out there. So after going through all of this, all the maps from all the time periods, the historical stuff, the modern stuff, I put absolutely everything that I've seen into this big, massive database, a big list of every single quarry, all of them, whatever date they were. And then I was able to assign them a possible date with like a probability. So the likelihood of how ancient they were. So if they were absolutely modern, they got like a 1. And if they were 100% definitely Roman, they got a 5. So there were only 7 Roman quarries that have been conclusively identified along the whole length of Hadrian's Wall. And the only ones that have been identified because of the inscriptions that they have. There aren't any quarries that don't have inscriptions that have been confirmed as being Roman 100%. But my final database had something like 500 quarries in it. So we're looking at 7 out of 500 that we know are definitely Roman. Okay. Right, okay. I'm going to move on to the next section now, material requirements. Okay, so now that I've said there are up to 500 quarries in the wall area, and we only know 7 of them are Roman, but hundreds of them don't have dates at all. That means we've got lots and lots and lots of stone quarries, and we don't know when they're from or why they were opened. So I thought it would be very interesting to compare how much stone was needed for the wall with how much stone we know that they were able to take from the Roman quarries. And the first issue with this was the wall's design. So I'm not going to go too deep into this debate because it is something that people can focus on too much. What I decided what to do was to make 3 different estimates rather than say conclusively which one I think is the correct one. So I made an estimate for the wall with a slope top. And this design would have been useful to help stone stay away from the core, because stone seeping into the core can cause damage to the wall, and it would need repairs more frequently. The parapet, which is more of a defensive design if people were going to be fighting from the top of the wall, and then the flat top wall, which is obviously the most simple one, but it means it's the most prone to damage from water coming into the top. Okay, so when I was working out these volumes, I did a couple of different things. I made 3D reconstructions, and I used this type of software, which you can see on the right-hand side. And that basically you take a picture of the wall straight on, as straight as you can possibly get it. And then you draw around the areas which are the stone, and you leave the rest of it blank. So I was able to say, you know, 70% of the wall was stone and 30% of the wall was mortar. And then you can say, if you know the volume of the wall, you can say 70% of the volume of the whole wall was stone, and they needed this amount of stone and this amount of mortar or clay or whatever the material was that was being used to bind the wall together. So that was what I did there. I ended up with these kinds of estimates. There's some updated ones, which are in my thesis, which people are welcome to look at if they want to, but there's lots and lots of tables. I didn't want to put them all in because I didn't want to sort of bore you all too much with all these numbers. But I compared the results that I came up with to results from other studies which had done a similar thing, also trying to estimate volume of the wall. And they came up largely the same. So I was quite satisfied that the methods I used were working sufficiently. So you can see, for example, if the wall had a sloped top, the total volume for just the wall of its own, this is not including the mile castles, the forts, or the turrets, would be 1.3 million meters cubed, which is an enormous amount of stone. Later on, I did add in the other buildings, and it got, I think I was talking about weights, I think it was something like 3.4 million metric tons or something. It was just an absolutely astonishing amount of stone. So what I needed to do was take the LiDAR, which is the 3D mapping stuff that I looked at before, and measure the surface area of the quarry and how deep the quarry was. And I could say this quarry could have potentially supplied 600,000 meters cubed of stone. But the quarrying process itself actually creates a lot of waste. So everything you remove from the quarry can't be used as a building stone, because you have to cut it down to size, and you'll get layers of stone which are very thin and weak, not a very good quality stone. So you have to make an estimate which is like maybe only 60% of the stone from this quarry would be usable, and then add that up for all the different quarries. So this is how much they would have had from all the 7 quarries, and this is how much they would have needed. And what I discovered was that only of the major Roman quarries we know about, they could only have supplied about 20% of the total requirement of stone for the wall, which was very interesting. I knew that there would be some disparity, but I didn't realize it would be so dramatic. But to me personally, that makes me think that certainly several of the undated quarries should be from the Roman period. Something else that was pointed out was that the 20% that they did meet, the Roman ones, is roughly the same as the amount of stone needed for the face of the wall and the core of the wall. So about 80% of the wall is this core material, it's rubble, and then 20% of it is the facing stones, which have been cut into shape. So it could be that the stone that was quarried from these centrally organized large quarries was used for the facing, and then stone for the rubble core was taken from smaller, less organized pits that were sort of all the way along the wall, which I thought was quite a neat explanation. But yeah, anyway, I'm going to move on now. Okay, we're into fieldwork now. So the first part of the fieldwork and the archaeological evidence I want to talk about was inscriptions. I feel like I have to redeem myself a little bit, because I took everybody on a big walk to Coombe Crag, and we spent a long time trying to find the Queen's Crag inscription, and we didn't find it. Even though I'd seen it before, I couldn't believe it, so we completely missed it. But the background on this slide is the Queen's Crag inscription in the photo when I did find it the first time. And I've included a list of all the other known Roman inscriptions at Hadrian's Wall that are currently in RIB. I know that there's been some very recent new small inscriptions that haven't made it into RIB yet, but these are the ones accurate at the time of me writing them. And there was 30 of them at the time. And part of my fieldwork was that I wanted to go out into the field and try and find all of them to make sure that they were okay, if they survived, what kind of condition they were in. And I did find that quite a lot of them are still there and in good condition. But with the inscriptions, even though they're the most important type of evidence that we have to date things, they're also the part that I think has the most issues. There are lots of different things that make studying the inscription quite complicated. So I wanted to explain those a little bit. Just going to check the time. Okay. Right, so I'm going to go through that. The first one, right. I don't know, some of you all might be aware of this, but if you've been doing anything to do with Quarries of Hadrian's Wall or Hadrian's Wall in the past year or two with WallCAP, you'll have heard people talk about the River Gelt inscriptions a lot, lots and lots and lots. They're sort of unanimously, it's like everyone's favorite Roman quarry at Hadrian's Wall is the Gelt ones. But what that is reflecting is the last 200 years where scholarship has focused on the Gelt inscriptions because it finds them preferable to the other inscriptions. And I've actually got a quote here which sums up like the issue quite well. We have not thought it necessary to notice the rude letters carved upon the Coombe Crag, which more probably were meant to commemorate a mechanic or a peasant than an emperor. So you can see this obvious classism coming in from the antiquarians very, very early on. That was 1816. But because these very early, very important publications about Hadrian's Wall focused on the River Gelt over the other inscriptions, they just aren't mentioned at all in lots of the more recent ones. They just don't talk about them, even though they're still very useful and important. The only thing different about one of the Gelt inscriptions is that it actually provides a specific date to 1 year because it mentions the consuls in Rome. Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to move on. We've also got forgeries. And one of the other major issues with the antiquarians was that there was a big disagreement amongst them about whether the wall was built in Hadrian's reign or Severan, the Severan period. So there's an inscription which is a complete forgery on Coombe's Crag, which was created by somebody who was trying to give it more evidence that it was from a specific period. But that one was uncovered. Sorry, someone's trying to phone me. What is going on here? What's he doing? Okay. Sorry, everyone. I'm just getting loads of calls. Right. Okay. So we've got forgeries. We've got people that don't think they're fancy enough. And then this was almost the most worrying one to me. A publication from 1990 actually said that some of the inscriptions were completely gone. They were just lost forever. They've said, at Coombe Crag, Cumbria, where the whole of the worked surface seems to have spalled off since the inscriptions were recorded 50 or more years ago. And having been myself, I know some of the people here probably also have been to Coombe Crag. You will know that that is not true. The inscriptions are still there. And I have a picture here. This is the face of the quarry at Coombe Crag that I've made into sort of a photo mosaic. And you can see to the far left and the far right, they're quite small, but you can see 4 inscriptions, which are the names of people who've inscribed, well, their names onto the quarry face. I'm so sorry. My phone will not stop ringing. Okay, right, so there we go. Coombe Crag, the inscriptions do survive, but we've got errors in modern work, which might actually be a hand-me-down issue from the 1800s, where people have just not been visiting them because they don't think they're as important. Okay, we've also got lots of lost inscriptions. This is another one from the 1800s. It's Clayton, who is talking about going for a ride on his horse around the various quarries around the Hadrian's Wall area, where he found an inscribed stone. And he went up to some quarrymen and he said, "Oh, wow, you've uncovered this inscription. That's amazing. Please, can you keep it safe for me until I come back?" And when he went back, it says, "The next time I rode that way, it had been shivered to atoms." So it was, they just completely destroyed it, which is very, very unfortunate, but I imagine that happened lots of times. And it was just lucky that he even noticed it was there this time, because I think they probably destroyed lots of things without actually mentioning them to anyone. So here we go. Okay, this is one of the inscriptions that I was talking about from the River Gelt. There's several inscriptions there, the written rock of Gelt. I went a few years ago now to take pictures of these. I think it was maybe 2015, 2016. And this is the condition that it was in at the time. It had lots of plants growing over it. The stone was quite soft and there was water running over the face of it. But since then, there's been conservation work, and this is the same inscription, which has been cleared away, all the plants have been cleared away, and it's been recorded in 3D, as a 3D model to preserve it, which is really great. And that was work that was done at the University of Newcastle. So there's been some really good developments there with preserving these inscriptions. And I hope that me climbing up there to take pictures of it didn't help to degrade it in any way, because it was a little bit of a risky climb at that time with the plants all still there. There we go. Okay, right, let's take a quick drink. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the other types of archaeological evidence now. I've split it up into a few groups. We've got tool marks and wedge holes, cut stone, spoil heaps, and artifacts or other items. That's not an exhaustive list. There are lots of other types of evidence you can find for quarrying, but these are the main ones. So the first one here, we've got tool marks. Right, so both of these pictures are actually of the quartz dolerite or the whinstone. One of them is from Limestone Corner, and one of them is from up near Walltown Crags. So the first one is a wedge hole, which is where the quarryman would insert a long iron wedge, they're about this size, into the hole, and they would create a series of holes along the natural bedding plane of the stone, and then hammer those in until they split the stone along a sort of, usually along a place where it would naturally split, but sometimes if it's a certain type of stone, they don't have those kind of beds in them, it's not sedimentary stone. So they hammered those in and then it would split along. So this is a spot where a hole has been created and then they've abandoned it or not, decided not to split the stone and just moved on. And then on the other side, on the right hand side, we've got these other holes, which could be wedge holes, but it's also possible that these are Lewis holes. And a Lewis was a type of lifting device that was used to move around very big, heavy stones. So it looks like it's almost like a pair of scissors. And then as you lift it up, they sort of close tighter together, and then you use that to lift the stone up. So that would have involved like quite a large piece of equipment that would have had to be brought to the quarry. It would have been quite an involved process. And this stone is very, very hard to split, very hard to move around. It's extremely heavy. So at Limestone Corner, the work was abandoned and they just left it behind like this instead of continuing to try and break the stone down into smaller pieces. But that was part of the ditch. That's not a quarry. Okay. Right. So cut stone at several of the quarries that you can see. These ones are not dated as Roman quarries. These are quarries which don't have dates. You can see quite obvious evidence where stone's been removed in blocks. So the one on the right hand side is particularly obvious. You can even see a tree started to grow in and support the overhang there. And something that I noticed with these quarries is that even though, in my opinion, these are clearly not natural outcrops, these are sites which are being quarried, they weren't marked on any maps as quarries at all. So they weren't open as an operating quarry in the 1800s. Some of them aren't even marked as a crag. They're just completely unrecorded. And those are the ones in my database and in my thesis that I think are the most likely to have been associated with the Roman period, or certainly, you know, medieval. These are older quarries than from the 1800s. Okay, spoil heaps. So this is a modern spoil heap. This is from the sort of Barkham Hill area at the railway sleeper quarries, and this is a more modern one. They're very obvious, this type of spoil heap, and they're newer. The more ancient quarries have spoil heaps which are completely overgrown, so you almost can't see them except when you're trying to walk over them, and you're on this very, very uneven ground. There's rubble underneath you, and they're quite treacherous, but you can see these all the time. All quarries will have a spoil heap of some kind. Sometimes they're like very big and broken up like this, and that's usually because blasting is being used. Yeah, I mean, the bigger the chunks are in the spoil heap and the sharper it is, the more likely it is that it's being blasted and not quarried using older quarry methods. Okay, and then we've got artifacts or other items. This is the only thing that I found in any of the quarries at all, which might be an item, which, yeah, it's the only thing. I haven't found any tools or coins or anything like that. Obviously you would leave it where it was if you did find something like that. And this is the only thing I uncovered. This was at the quarry. I'll go back to it. This one with the tree on the right hand side was where I found this item, which looks like some kind of trough. It might have been a trough for water. It might have been a trough for a blacksmith, because they would have needed blacksmiths in the quarries to be working on their tools, because the tools would wear out very quickly and they need a little bit of water to cool the tools down in. But it looks quite a lot like the water basins that you see at Housesteads for in the sort of bathrooms, and they're just lying around. It could have been for animals, and it might not even be Roman at all. You couldn't say with a stone artifact like this, but it's certainly man-made. And it's still where I found it, left it alone. Okay, right, I think this is kind of the last bit. That's good. Okay, so right, now I'm going to talk about the petrological testing. This was something that I really wanted to do, because as I was looking through the previous studies that were looking at the wall, there was lots of people that said it would be really good if we could do petrological testing, but it's not something we've been able to do yet. And I was a little bit naive. I was like, oh, I'll just do it, that'll be fine. But it was actually really, really quite complicated. Partially because of getting permissions to get samples, which I really dramatically underestimated how complicated that would be. And then actually getting to grips with the different types of analysis that I need to do on the stones. But it did actually work out much better than I thought. It went better than I hoped. So I'm quite excited to show you what I came across while I was doing all this. I did two types of analysis on the stones that I was able to collect. I did thin sections of the stones, and then I analysed those. And I also did XRF, which is a type of chemical analysis where you get a stone sample and you crush it into a powder and you put in an X-ray machine. You fire the X-rays at it, and then it tells you what different chemicals are in the stone, like what different elements are in the stone. And sometimes it can tell you oxides like iron oxide or calcium oxide. So you can compare the physical characteristics of the stone with the chemical aspects of the stone. So you can say, you might have two stones that you can see in real life and they're both kind of red and they're both kind of fine grained, and you say, well, these look the same. They're probably the same, you know, this quarry probably supplied this bit of the wall. But even though their physical characteristics are the same, if you analyze them and their geochemistry is very different, you can eliminate it. So you need the one thing to kind of balance out the other one. I've got a list here where I got my archaeological samples from. I managed to get samples at Chester's, Housesteads, Bird Oswald, Carlisle Castle, Sycamore Gap, and Corbridge. The Carlisle Castle samples are from a stone yard, which is around the back, which was sort of like left behind for some reason, but these big piles of stones. And then in the middle of this big pile of stones were this whole Roman altar, which is very strange. I think it is still there. So the stones from Carlisle Castle were undated, but everything else was definitely Roman. Okay, so this is what the thin section process kind of looks like. I would show you some pictures of this. So you get your stone, you put it into a little sample cup, and then you fill it with resin, and then you put that in a vacuum, and then the vacuum makes sure that the resin gets distributed all the way through the stone and fills in all the holes and everything, and there's no bubbles in it. So you take that out, you saw through it so you get a flat face, and then you polish the face of the stone, stick it onto a slide, and then you chop the whole top off so that you end up with just a very, very thin slice of the stone that's stuck onto the slide. And then you have to sort of sand that down until it's so thin you can see through it with the light. So I've got some pictures of what it looks like through a microscope. So as I was doing this, you have to keep going, keep sanding it down thinner and thinner until it's like 1/3 of a millimeter thick. And then you shine cross-polarized light through it. And that creates this effect I'm going to show you here on this video, where as you spin the sample around, the crystals in the quartz grains, the angles of them change, so the way the light comes through them changes, and it does this really amazing thing. I'll see all the colors changing here. You can kind of see that. So at this point, that sample was not finished yet, because you're supposed to get it basically so there's no color showing up at all. When it's just quartz like that, it should be kind of gray and black and white. But you have to keep checking it over and over again in the microscope to make sure that you've got it thin enough. But even though it needs to be the sort of grays and whites, it does look much prettier, I think, when it's at the sort of rainbow stage. Okay, right. So once you get your thin sections, and they look a little bit like this one that's on the left-hand side, I went through them all and I wrote down their characteristics. So I'd look at how well sorted they were. I've got a little diagram of the sorting at the top here, and how rounded they were. WallCAP has a guide that goes through all of this, rounding and sorting and the different types of things you can see in a thin section, that was written by the geologist Ian Keel. So if you want to look at this in more depth, I would recommend going and looking at his guide. But I went through these various things and I put them into like a spreadsheet where I, said what the characteristics of the stone were. And I also wrote down any inclusions in the stone that I could identify myself. So we've got things like mica, which you can see on the left-hand side, and that's that sort of golden kind of long, thin material. And that gives the stone this, when you see a sandstone, it has kind of a sparkly quality. I think that, creates that sort of sparkly thing. And people use that material still sometimes in like cosmetics and things. The next one is feldspar. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. It's right at the top of the screen. My little bar is kind of covering it up. But there's a grain right up at the top, which is cross-hatched. And that's got this thing, it's called tartan twinning or twinning. And that's a feldspar, which is a type of stone that you can identify quite easily in these types of things. And if you find a stone in a building that has lots of feldspars in it, and in a quarry, it's something that you can say that, they have in common. And then the one on the far side is coal. So you do see quite a lot of coal in these samples as well, because lots and lots of the stone is from the Carboniferous period. So there's lots of coal. There's obviously lots of coal seams around. So you do see that quite often, little bits of coal coming up. Yeah, and what that meant I was able to do was to take the quarry samples and the archaeological samples and group them together into their similar characteristics. So that this is just an example here of stones that I analysed and wrote down all the qualities of and then put them all together. So the top ones are from Housesteads. I think, I can't see the top, I'm pretty sure it's Housesteads. And then the bottom ones are from Queen's Crag and Cragwood. And you can see they have various similarities. They're not 100% exactly the same, but it's just an example of what I was able to do, putting them into these groups. And once they were in these groups, then I could do the geochemical analysis and see if they were similar from the XRF results. Okay, right. So I'm going to talk about the XRF now. I took these samples. I took XRF samples and thin section samples from everything, because I wanted to make sure I had, one version of each thing. Okay, so the type of XRF that I did was a crushed powder method. There's a few different types of methods, but that was what I did. So you crush it into a fine powder, And then you put it into a sample cup and into the X-ray machine. So I had to crush all the stones by hand in a mortar and pestle, which was actually quite difficult for some of them because the limestones are very hard. Here we go. This is what the sample, I did a little diagram of the sample cup here. So this is how it all gets laid out before it goes in the machine. Yeah, so you get this. Okay. And then you end up with something like this at the end of it all, right? Your results when they come out of the machine just look like numbers on a spreadsheet and they're a nightmare. But I did something called principal component analysis, which is a type of statistical analysis on the results from the XRF. And what that does is it looks at the characteristics of the stones, and then it kind of puts them across a chart. So the ones that have similarities cluster together. And before I did this, I wasn't sure that it would work at all. It was just 100% an experiment just to see what would come up. But what you can see here is all the samples that are black are archaeological samples, and all the samples that are colored are from the quarries. Each color is a different quarry. And the ones that are bright pink, which I'll try and point out if I can. I think I can annotate it. Yeah, like this one and this one. These are control samples that I took from Scotland to put in because I wanted to make sure that the Hadrian's Wall ones had their own thing that was slightly different than the Scottish ones, which seems to have worked okay. They are mostly on the outsides, the control samples that I took. And I've put circles around the quarry groupings. So you can see some of them do overlap a little bit, and some of them are a little bit distinct. But all that means is if you've got, say you've got lots of archaeological samples and they are coming up with the same kind of chemical result to the quarry samples, it's more likely that that quarry supplied that part of Hadrian's Wall. So the only part that is sticking out here at all is this one, which I've just drawn a line through. And that's actually the Housesteads samples and one of the quarries, which is only about like 100 meters away from Housesteads Roman fort. So that was, I thought that was quite a strong result that they came up so close together in the in this plot, because they also were similar in the thin sections. So that was quite conclusive for me. It's an undated quarry, that one, but it's right next to where the fort is, and it's similar in both parts. Okay. I don't know if I can rub those away, clear it. Here we go. I think I might be near the end now. Can I put away this? Yeah. Oh, it won't let me go past the slide. Right, okay, right. I'll just, before I leave the slide, I'll just say a few main things. Okay, so there were a few main kind of takeaways from everything that I did in my PhD. The first thing was that there are big difficulties in dating quarries in general because the quarry methods have changed very little from the Roman period into the late medieval and early modern periods. The tools and the methods were pretty much unchanged. So if you want to do a study like this, where you try to split them up into potential periods of time when they were opened, you need to use something other than just the archaeological evidence. You can't only look at the tool marks. You need to do something like taking stone samples or looking at mapping or historical archives, something like that, because just purely doing the fieldwork on its own isn't enough to give you the answers that you want to find. And even with all of the extra stuff that I've done, it's still been very difficult to classify them into different groupings. The second thing that was very important was how much stone the quarries we know about were able to supply. There's a big difference between how much stone we were able to find in the quarries to how much was needed for the wall. It's quite different. So I think that there are definitely some quarries around the area which would have been opened by the Roman army, but we don't know which ones. All I've been able to do is to say which ones it's most likely to be and which ones it definitely was not. Another very important point is that even if we do see a quarry, which is on a map in the 18th century as being open, that doesn't mean that it wasn't opened earlier than that. it just means it could have been reopened. Oftentimes, if there's an area of stone that's been exposed, it's pre-opened, it's not got trees over it anymore, it's like easy access. People later on, who presumably don't know when it's from or why it was open in the first place, can just go back in there and reopen that quarry, and it's easier than starting from scratch. So that would completely destroy any Roman evidence that was on the face of that quarry. So ones that I have in my own database that say they're like, you know, a 5, they're definitely not Roman. Even those ones, we can't say 100%. They might have been open much longer ago, but there's just no evidence on them anymore. So I have to discount them because the evidence has definitely been destroyed. And one of the final things is with my petrological testing, I would say, even though getting permissions and getting samples across the board, I think I ended up with about 80 samples from across Hadrian as well, was quite difficult to do. I do think that there's potential in it to sort of improve on what I've done and make it more accurate, because before I started, the general consensus was that it wouldn't work at all, especially the XRF. Analyzing thin sections is a really well established field in general, but the XRF part is not advised that people do that on sandstone at the moment because it's unreliable for lots of different reasons. But from what I've seen, it might be a useful thing to do, and I think it's worth looking into it more, to try it on other sites maybe, or to expand it further, looking at other parts of Hadrian as well. And I know that that's something WallCAP are looking into, doing different types of XRF and also non-destructive types of XRF where you don't need to actually remove the stone at all. So yeah, it's very interesting. I think I'm going to stop it there and then move on to questions, which I have here. And I've also put, I don't know if anybody wants to send around a slideshow after, but you're welcome to send it out to people as well. But I've put my email address on here. It's just my personal email because I move jobs all the time. So just my personal email is easier to reach me on. And then the bibliography of the publications that I mentioned while I was talking. But yeah, I'll leave that there for now. Okay. And I'll wait to hear if there's questions. I don't know how I should check.